The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD ushered in the Dark Ages in Europe. During this period, Gothics, Vandals and Huns swept down on Europe from the north and the east. The Dark Age ushered in depopulation, deurbanization and increased barbarian invasion. The breakdown of Roman society was dramatic. The patchwork of petty rulers was incapable of supporting the depth of civic infrastructure required to maintain libraries, public baths, arenas, and major educational institutions. Cities and merchants lost their economic benefits of safe conditions of trade and manufacture. Intellectual development suffered from the loss of a unified cultural and educational milieu. But from the 9th century, the establishment of the feudal system allowed a return to systemic agriculture.
The transition debate that we tend to look at is essentially the one that was begun with Maurice Dobbs' intervention on the question of the connection between feudalism and the rise of capitalism. Maurice Dobbs' work on the economic development of capitalism presented the argument that the structural problems of feudalism led to collapse because a set of internal contradictions, and the manner in which it collapsed, the time in which it collapsed, also subsequently influenced the rise of capitalism. According to Karl Marx, the feudal mode of production was predominantly characterized by the manner in which the relationship was established between the feudal lord and the serf, who was basically providing the economic resources on which the feudal structure rested. Maurice Dobbs, building on a generation of historical scholarship which came in the early 20th century, fleshed out the argument a little more by looking at the detailed economic character of feudalism as a phenomenon. This was completely distinct from the juridical or the political interpretations of feudalism which had been given by historians like François Ganshoff and Georges Duby, and relied essentially on interventions made by historians like Marc Bloch. Maurice Dobbs, following Marc Bloch, argued that feudalism as an economic phenomenon rested on the primacy of land as a means of generating economic resource. Maurice Dobbs argued, following historians who preceded him, that the feudal economy was essentially a land-based economy, and it was also an economy of no outlets. This built on a generation of historical scholarship which had shown how European overseas commerce, which had characterized the Roman Empire, came to a standstill from around the 7th or 8th centuries, and by the 9th century, the European practice of overseas commerce was completely at standstill as a result of several political developments that characterized this period.
The development of fiefs was influenced by the Roman institution of patricianum and the German influence of mendium, by which the powerful surrounded themselves with men who rendered them service, especially military service, in exchange of protection. This service and protection contract came to involve the granting of a beneficium by the way of use of land, which later became hereditary.
The European economy at this point of time gradually became demonetized on account of multiple invasions from all sides, as a result of which the entire character of the economy gradually shifted from commercial and industrial to agricultural. In this, whoever controlled land or whoever established his military hegemony over land was automatically in charge of the principal economic resource of this point of time. As historians had shown, Maurice Dobbs was arguing, was with the collapse of central authority in Europe in the 9th century, gradually local political authority of the feudal lords, of the seigneurs, who were basically military aristocrats holding charge of a castle and providing military security from external invasions. The lives of the seigneur was basically in this background. And feudalism as an economic phenomenon was initiated when individual peasants seeking protection from depredations of Saracens and Vikings and Magyars sought refuge from the feudal lord.
Local royal officers and great landholders increased their power and forced the king to grant them rights of private justice and immunity from royal interference. By these processes, feudalism became fixed in the Frankish lands by the end of the 10th century.
Because the primary function of the centralized authority, a primary function of a monarchy, so to say, was to provide military security to the people at large. With the failure of the crown, with the failure of the monarchical institution to discharge this responsibility, individual feudal lords of the local, of the various localities of Europe, various regions of Europe, their ability to discharge the same function, their ability to discharge the military responsibility that was till then discharged by the monarchy, gave them a kind of leverage over the society around them that they never had earlier. With a broad sweep of around 100 years, one can say that gradually the feudal lord, who was extending only military production, gradually began to dominate also the juridical functions of the state, which he gradually appropriated and subsequently went on to be the master of the whole countryside. By offering military protection to the peasants, he demanded in return that the peasants should give him resources with which the military protection could be given. And in this manner, the feudal lord established a position of predominance over the peasantry, who were now made into servile human beings. The people who were previously free peasants gradually accepted a servile status under the feudal lord in order to save their lives and in order to save their livelihood. And in this manner, the feudal economy was born, where land-based production was the only major economic activity, and all the social surplus that was generated in the field of agriculture within the bounds of the estate of a feudal lord. And this estate was generally called the manor, was the nerve center of economic production in Europe during the feudal era. The economic production in the feudal estate was used to rest on the phenomenon that was known therefore as serfdom. Because the serf, who was the individual peasant who had hardly any rights under the feudal era, except of course to the right of his own person, he was entirely dependent on the feudal lord, both in social and in economic and in juridical terms. The whole land of the estate was generally divided into three segments. There were the demesne lands, which belonged to the lord himself. There were the tenement holdings, which was those areas of the village where the peasants lived and cultivated. And there were also the common lands, which was held by the estate as a whole. The serf, the peasant who was now enjoying a servile status, had to cultivate the land of the demesne, the land of the feudal lord, for a specified number of days of the week. That was by way of his payment of rent to the feudal lord. So this essentially was what contributed the social surplus to which the feudal lord was entitled. For the remaining days, the serf would be cultivating the tenement holdings, from which his own sustenance would be acquired. Also, this land, the proceeds of this land the cultivation of this land would ultimately go by way of payment of church dues. The common lands, which was basically the forests, the marshes, the swamps, the ponds, the river, had whatever resources they had were to be shared in common. Within the arena of the feudal estate, all production-related decisions were to be taken either by the feudal lord or by his designated agent known as the bailiff. So the feudal lord was the pivotal factor in deciding what was to be produced, how much of it was to be produced, and what was to be done with the proceeds. So this economy of no outlets, because there was no market to cater to, with the decline of the commercial trajectory that Europe had built over a period of 2000 years, with the decline of commerce after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the gradual demonetization of the economy, whatever was being produced in the feudal setup was basically being consumed inside the estate. Nothing, almost nothing, was being produced with catering to the demands of a distant market in mind. Now, Maurice Dobb argues that this economy of no outlets was beginning to change as a result of a very crucial phenomenon that could be seen in the 11th century. In the 11th century, as feudalism as a political phenomenon was reaching its height, also witnessed the emergence of the re-emergence of the European towns, with a florescence of commerce in the Italian peninsula. From the 11th century, the Italian merchants began to dominate the commerce of Western Mediterranean once again, and also began transactions with the East. With the rise of the Crusader states after the First Crusade, and the need to maintain trading connections between the Crusader states in Asia Minor, in the Levant, with the Western Mediterranean civilizations from which these Crusaders hailed, the commercial connections between Asia and Europe were once again being revived for the first time since the 8th, 9th century. As a consequence of this, the trading connections between the East and West managed to revive the towns of the Italian peninsula that had built and thrived around the commercial civilization that the Romans had built up. In the 11th century, beginning from the 11th century, this revival of commerce had managed to impact substantially the economy of feudal Europe. This was because even though almost entire production of the feudal estate was being devoted to its own consumption, the feudal estate was by no means fully self-sufficient. There were occasions when commodities would have to be brought in from the outside. There were commodities such as salt, which could not be manufactured in the feudal estate, it could be produced only in coastal regions of Europe, had to be brought in, which was an item of daily necessity. Another major trading commodity which was absolutely necessary in European cuisine was spices. Although spices do not play in European food the role that they do in, say, a region like South Asia or East Asia, nevertheless, spices had a different perspective altogether in European life, because spices were used as preservative of meat at a time when there was no artificial refrigeration possible, and spices were used to make sauce that would frequently cover the smell of putrid meat in winter. And spices would have to be acquired from Asia. So even at the height of the feudal times, this sort of connection by way of salt and spices required the feudal estate to deal with the world outside it. And generally, salt as much as spices would be procured by the mercatore, or the merchants of the Italian towns and the French towns and the Flemish towns. The towns were pivotal in procuring these essential items of daily use for the feudal estate. In return, the feudal estate provided the agricultural crops, the agricultural products, which was pivotal for the survival of the towns themselves. So even at a time when European economy was essentially demonetized, some sort of barter had always continued, by which the feudal estate would provide the grains and the towns would provide the spices. The feudal estate would provide the meat and the town would provide the salt. By the 12th and 13th century, as the European commercial sector began to revive, began to flourish once again, Maurice Dobb argued a new set of pressures were generated. Because the merchants who were flourishing in their trade with the East were no longer content in bringing only spices from the East. So when they were bringing in spices from the markets of Damascus or Alexandria, they were also bringing in other items such as muslin, such as silk, luxury items, and of course the other thing was incense, which was used as incense sticks in the churches. And feudal lords had this urge to establish themselves as physically and visibly distinct from the people they presided over. So a mere difference in the fact that on the table of the feudal lord there would be more meat than that of the serf was not enough by way of a social signifier of status. So when the merchant was able to bring in new items from other parts of the world, from Damascene fabrics from Damascus, muslin from Mosul and Baghdad and Alexandria, and silk, the feudal lord was very eager to buy these items of daily use, which were nevertheless luxurious items, which the ordinary serfs would not be able to afford. In this given situation, there was a problem that the feudal structure generated. In the feudal system, although the feudal lord had more or less complete rights over what the serf would do, how much he would work on demesne, how much he would work in the tenement holdings, there was one problem. Once the revenue demand, once the rental demand has been settled, it was very difficult to increase it. Because if it had been settled that the 3 days were necessary for the peasant to sustain himself and therefore to work on his own tenement, it also meant that the peasant would not be asked to work for more than 3 days on the demesne. And once this pattern was established over a period of 100 years or so, the feudal law dictated that the rights of the peasants could not be violated. So Maurice Taub argued that the very internal, there was this problem of the feudal structure, that it killed productivity. Since the peasant had no additional incentive to produce, he was not likely to produce more. And given the rights accorded to him by the feudal law, the peasant could not be asked to work more on the demesne lands. So at this stage, the feudal structure imposed a limitation on the demand that the feudal lord could generate. The feudal lord generally tended to respond, Maurice Taub would argue,